Welcome to my channel.
The rain in the northwest Highlands of Scotland does not so much fall as it aggressively colonizes the air. It is a fine, penetrating dynamic that finds its way past the sturdiest wax cotton jackets and settles deep into the bones, breeding a specific type of melancholic inertia. Police Constable Hamish Macbeth loved it. On a morning when any sensible chief constable would have demanded a proactive patrol, Hamish was to be found exactly where he felt he belonged, standing waist-deep in the freezing waters of the River Arkaig, a poached salmon tucked securely inside his oversized tunic. He was a tall, lanky man with a shock of unruly red hair and large, innocent hazel eyes that disarmed everyone from hardened criminals to the local spinsters. To look at Hamish was to assume that up was a difficult concept for him to grasp. This was a deception he cultivated with the care a prize gardener gave to their roses. While the residents of Strathbane headquarters thought him a lazy, ambitionless tuchter, they left him alone in Lochstub, and as long as they left him alone, he could look after his hens, his dog lugs, and ensure that the law was applied with a heavy dose of Highland common sense, rather than bureaucratic rigidity. Just the one, lugs, Hamish murmured to the ugly, tufty-eared mutt sitting shivering on the bank. Lugs whined softly, eyeing the bulge in Hamish's tunic with greedy interest. "Och, don't look at me like that. It's for Mrs. Wellington. Her rheumatism is acting up, and a bit of fresh fish is just the tonic." Hamish scrambled up the bank, the squelch of his boots a rhythmic accompaniment to the sighing wind. Having successfully broken the law to serve the community, he decided it was time for his first official break of the day. The village of Lochstub creates a postcard-perfect curve around the seal-grey waters of the loch, backed by mountains that loomed with ancient, brooding indifference. At this hour, the only sign of life was the smoke curling from chimneys and the slow opening of the general store. Hamish made his way to the Lochstub Hotel, purely, he told himself, to gauge the morale of the tourists. In the hotel lobby, a man who looked entirely too orange for the prevailing weather conditions was currently dictating the morale. His name was Julian Vane, and he was the sort of Sassenach that made the locals long for the days of the Jacobite Rising. He was loud, wealthy from some vague venture in digital lifestyle branding, and he possessed an unshakable belief that the Highlands were a quaint theme park waiting for his modernization. Julian was currently berating the hotel manager, Mr. Johnson, who looked as though he were trying to dissolve into the patterned carpet. "It's about synergy, Johnson," Julian snapped, his voice carrying the harsh, grating quality of a chainsaw hitting a rock. He wore an expensive Italian silk suit that was entirely inappropriate for a Tuesday in Lochstub. "I've bought that derelict croft up on the hill. Turning it into the sanctuary. High-end, holistic mud therapy wellness. But I can't have my clientele looking out at this." He waved a manicured hand toward the window, indicating the stunning, rain-swept vista of the loch. "It's depressing. Can't you do anything about lighting in this village? It's all so grey." Mr. Johnson blinked. "The lighting, sir? You mean the sky?" Hamish slouched against the reception desk, looking, as was his custom, like a piece of abandoned upholstery. "Good morning to you, Mr. Vane," Hamish drawled, his voice a slow, soothing lilt. "I hear the mud up on that croft is exceptional, very therapeutic. My pigs used to love a good wallow in it before they went to the slaughter." Julian turned on Hamish, his eyes narrowing. He saw a tall, stupid-looking policeman with wet boots and a vague expression. "Look, Constable, whatever your name is, I am investing significant capital into this backwater. I expect cooperation, not a cheek about pigs." "Macbeth, sir. PC Hamish Macbeth," he replied, giving a slow, clumsy salute. "And we are very pro-investment in Lochstub. Why, just last week, Mrs. Galocci bought a new kettle for the BB, a very modern one. Whistles and everything." Julian made a noise of pure exasperation and marched off, his expensive shoes clicking sharply on the hardwood floor. "He's going to be trouble, Hamish," Mr. Johnson sighed, wiping sweat from his brow. "He's already offended the minister by offering to buy the pews to make rustic shelving, and he told Mrs. Grieve her scones were carbohydrate nightmares." "Och, hell calm down," Hamish said easily, eyeing the pot of coffee behind the counter. "Once the Highlands get their grip on him, hell either mellow out or the rain will wash him away back to London." But as Hamish watched Julian Vane's retreating back, a cold prickle passed over him that had nothing to do with the salmon in his tunic. There was a darkness to Julian's arrogant energy, the kind that often attracted violence. Hamish finally accepted the cup of coffee Mr. Johnson offered. He decided he would sit by the window and keep an eye on things. It looked like hard work, but someone had to do it. The rest of Tuesday unfolded with the glorious, uninterrupted monotony that Hamish treasured above all earthly riches. He spent the afternoon avoiding the police station entirely, choosing instead to chop kindling at a glacial pace behind his cottage. By evening, the relentless drizzle had exhausted itself, replaced by a thick, suffocating fog that crept off the loch like a living, breathing entity. It swallowed the street lamps of Lochstub whole, wrapping the village in a damp shroud. Inside his small kitchen, Hamish was a picture of domestic bliss. The poached salmon sizzled delightfully in a cast-iron pan atop the crackling wood stove, filling the room with a buttery aroma that made Lugs whimper in frantic anticipation. "Patience is a virtue, you greedy creature," Hamish muttered, tossing a small flake to the floor, which vanished before it hit the linoleum. He ate his supper in deep, satisfied silence, brewing a large pot of strong tea. The world outside felt a million miles away, and the arrogant Londoner with his grand plans for high-end mud therapies was entirely forgotten. Hamish banked the fire, settled into his armchair with a dog-eared book, and eventually drifted into a dreamless sleep, confident that tomorrow would be wonderfully uneventful. He was wrong. The telephone in the police station hallway possessed a shrill, demanding ring specifically designed to induce headaches. It started at exactly 6 o'clock the next morning, cutting through the freezing fog and Hamish's peaceful slumber like a rusty knife. He pulled his thin tartan blanket over his head, fervently hoping the caller would give up. Nobody in Lochstub had a genuine emergency at 6 in the morning. The ringing persisted, angry and unrelenting. With a profound sigh that carried the weight of a terribly wronged man, Hamish shoved the blanket aside. The cottage air was bitterly cold. He padded barefoot down the hallway, shivering in his striped pajamas, his red hair standing up in wild spikes. He yanked the receiver from its cradle. "Lochstub Police Station, Constable Macbeth speaking," he mumbled. "Hamish! It's Mrs. Wellington." The postmistress' voice was pitched an octave higher than usual, frantic and breathless. "You must come up to the old croft on the hill. Immediately. It's terrible, just terrible." Hamish rubbed his eyes, deep resentment settling into his stomach. "Mrs. Wellington, it is barely daylight." "What exactly is terrible?" "I am an English developer. He's dead, Hamish. Drowned in his own fancy muck." The remaining fog in Hamish's brain instantly evaporated, though his face maintained its characteristic mask of sleepy vacancy. A murder. Error, today. It meant paperwork, running around in the freezing cold, and worst of all, it meant Strathbane headquarters would be descending upon his beloved village like a plague of aggressive locusts. "Stay exactly where you are, Mrs. Wellington. Touch absolutely nothing. I will be there shortly." He hung up the phone and stared blankly at the wall for a full minute, mourning the loss of his quiet week. He dressed slowly and methodically, pulling on his thickest woolen socks and heavy uniform coat. "Come on, Lugs," he sighed, clipping the leash onto the terrier. "Duty calls, much to my eternal regret." The trek up the hill to the croft was miserable. The fog was so dense that Hamish could barely see 10 paces ahead, the damp cold biting at his cheeks. When he breached the crest of the hill, the skeletal outline of the ruined croft emerged from the grey mist. Next to it was a newly excavated pit, lined with timber and filled with a thick, dark, noxious-smelling sludge. Mrs. Wellington stood shivering violently near a stack of unused lumber, her face ashen. Hamish gave her a comforting pat on the shoulder before approaching the pit. The developer lay face down in the centre of the mud bath. He was dressed incongruously in a luxurious white silk bathrobe, now ruined by the dark slime. His arms were splayed out, sinking slowly into the thick mixture. Hamish crouched at the edge, his hazel eyes losing their sleepy glaze as they darted over the scene. To any casual observer, he looked like a bewildered local staring at a dead badger. But his mind was already cataloguing the oddities. There were no signs of a struggle on the muddy banks. The victim's silk slippers were placed neatly side by side near a discarded towel. Most peculiarly, there was a faint, sharp scent of bitter almonds cutting through the earthy stench of the mud. Hamish leaned closer, ignoring the damp seeping into his trousers. The man hadn't slipped. He hadn't been pushed while struggling. He had walked in calmly, or he had been incapacitated before his face touched the muck. Hamish stood up slowly, a heavy sigh escaping his lips. He was going to have to use the police radio, and DCI Blair was going to be absolutely furious. Hamish trudged slowly down the hillside, leaving Lugs tied to a sturdy fence post well away from the noxious pit. He needed the police radio in his Land Rover, a prehistoric vehicle smelling of wet wool. He picked up the heavy receiver, his finger hesitating over the transmit button. Once he made the call, His peaceful, fog-draped morning would be officially obliterated by the loud, aggressive reality of Strathbane Criminal Investigation Department. With a heavy sigh that fogged the chilled windows of the Land Rover, he pressed the button and reported the grim discovery. The dispatcher's voice crackled back, crisp and alarmed, promising the immediate dispatch of Detective Chief Inspector Blair. "May the Lord have mercy on us all," Hamish muttered, resting his forehead against the steering wheel. He trudged back up the hill to Mrs. Wellington, who was still shivering, her face pale against the thick, swirling mist. He gently instructed the postmistress to go home, lock her doors, and brew the strongest pot of tea she possessed. She sprinted down the heather-clad slope, eager to escape the morbid tableau. Hamish spent the next hour doing absolutely nothing. He stood by the pit, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, his hazel eyes completely blank, while his mind raced through the peculiar details. The neat slippers, the heavy scent of bitter almonds, the distinct lack of a struggle. This was no clumsy accident. The silence of the Highland morning was violently shattered by the wail of sirens. Through the dense fog, the headlights of 3 police cruisers pierced the gloom like angry yellow eyes. They screeched to a halt at the base of the hill, doors slamming with metallic finality. Leading the charge up the muddy incline was DCI Blair. He was a heavily built man with a face the color of raw beef and a temperament to match. He breathed heavily, his expensive trench coat already splashed with Highland muck, which only served to fuel his perpetual rage. Behind him trailed Detective Sergeants Jimmy Anderson and Harry Barclay, both looking miserable and hungover. "Macbeth!" Blair bellowed, his voice carrying the subtlety of a foghorn. "You useless, gangling idiot! Don't just stand there gawking like a brain-damaged sheep. Secure the perimeter." Hamish blinked slowly, adopting an expression of profound, uncomprehending innocence. "There is no perimeter to secure, sir," he drawled softly. "It is just the mud, the corpse, and the fog. I sent the only witness home because of her nerves." Blair's face turned an even deeper, more alarming shade of crimson. "You let the witness go? Are you entirely devoid of brain cells, Macbeth? You are a disgrace to the uniform. Point me to the stiff before I demote you to directing traffic in a ghost town." Hamish gestured vaguely toward the timber-lined pit. Blair stomped over, slipping slightly on the slick grass, and peered down at the developer's ruined silk bathrobe. He wrinkled his nose in disgust at the earthy, pungent smell of the mud bath, completely missing the delicate, lethal undertone of bitter almonds that Hamish had noted earlier. "Right!" Blair barked, clapping his thick hands together. "It is obvious what happened here. The arrogant Sassenach came up here to gloat over his new property. Some disgruntled locale, probably the hotel manager he was shouting at yesterday, followed him, bashed him over the head, and pushed him into the muck. Simple robbery and assault. Look at him, he's probably missing a fancy watch." "But, sir," Hamish said, his voice slow and hesitant, playing the part of the village idiot to perfection. "His slippers are placed very neatly by the edge, and there is no blood on the timber. Do you not think he might have been poisoned before he took a dip?" Blair whirled around, stepping dangerously close to Hamish, spraying spit as he shouted. "Poisoned? Do not try to play detective with me, Macbeth. You read too many cheap paperbacks. Highlanders do not use poison. They use fists and heavy, blunt objects. This is a simple, brutal assault by a savage local who resented the man's money. We are going down to that hotel to arrest Mr. Johnson right now." Hamish simply nodded, his face impassive. "Aye, sir. You are the boss? Very astute of you, sir." "Shut up, Macbeth," Blair growled, turning back to his sergeants. "Anderson, Barclay, get the forensics team up here to fish this aristocrat out of the slime. And Macbeth, you stay out of my way. Do not speak to anyone, do not touch anything, and do not pretend you have a single intelligent thought in that empty ginger head of yours." Hamish gave a clumsy, exaggerated salute. As the Strathbane detectives swarmed the scene, Hamish slowly backed away, retreating to his Land Rover to begin his own mooching investigation. Hamish drove his battered Land Rover down the winding, fog-slicked track with agonizing slowness, thoroughly enjoying the sound of Detective Chief Inspector Blair's muffled shouting fading into the mist behind him. Let the Strathbane men freeze their polished shoes in the Highland muck. Hamish had more pressing matters to attend to, namely his own stomach and the village gossip network, which was vastly superior to any forensic laboratory in Scotland. He parked a discreet distance from the Lochdub Hotel. The front entrance was already a circus of police activity, with Blair's booming voice echoing across the cobblestones as he gleefully prepared to terrorize poor Mr. Johnson. Hamish bypassed the spectacle entirely, slipping down a narrow alleyway that smelled faintly of stale beer and damp earth, and let himself in through the kitchen door. The hotel kitchen was a sanctuary of warmth and the rich, comforting scent of frying bacon. At the massive cast-iron stove stood Jessie, a young maid with flour dusted across her apron and eyes as wide as saucers. She jumped, clutching a wooden spoon like a weapon, as Hamish's lanky frame appeared in the doorway. "Och, Hamish, you gave me a fright," she gasped, her shoulders dropping in relief. "Is it true? Is the terrible English developer really dead up at the old croft?" "I am afraid so, Jessie," Hamish said softly, pulling out a stool and folding himself onto it with the grace of a collapsing deck chair. "And a terrible tragedy it is, though I suspect the mourning will be remarkably brief. Now, I do not suppose there is a spare cup of tea going. The fog up that hill has chilled me to the marrow." Jessie immediately set about pouring a massive mug of strong, dark tea and pushed a plate of warm scones toward him. "It's a madhouse out front. That awful red-faced policeman from Strathbane is shouting at Mr. Johnson, accusing him of murder." Hamish took a slow, appreciative bite of a scone, letting the butter melt on his tongue. "Mr. Blair has a very vivid imagination. But between you and me, Jessie, Mr. Johnson couldn't murder a fly without apologizing to it first. Tell me, what was the developer up to last night? Did he seem worried? Frightened?" Jessie scoffed, wiping down the floury counter. "Frightened? That man was too full of his own importance to be scared of anything. He sat in the lounge barking orders at everyone. But he did have a visitor, right around 9 o'clock. Hamish paused, his teacup hovering inches from his lips. He let his face fall into its customary slack, sleepy expression. "A visitor, you say? Anyone from the village?" No, Jessie whispered, leaning in closer, thrilled to be part of the drama. "It was a woman, very smartly dressed, expensive coat, smelling of fancy perfume. She wasn't from Lochdub, I can tell you that. She marched right up to his table, and they had a fierce, whispered argument. Did you happen to hear what they were arguing about?" Hamish asked mildly, taking another sip of tea. "I only caught a bit when I was collecting the empty glasses. She hissed something about him taking everything and ruining her life. Then she slammed a little glass vial on the table. He just laughed at her, that horrible, grating laugh of his, and tucked the vial into his pocket. She stormed out a minute later. Hamish's mind raced. A glass vial. The distinct bitter scent of almonds lingering over the mud bath. It was all clicking together with a neatness that Blair's brute force methods would completely obliterate. The poison hadn't been in the mud it had been administered beforehand, perhaps mixed into a bedtime drink, kicking in just as the arrogant developer went for his midnight holistic wallow. "You have a very sharp eye, Jessie," Hamish praised gently, finishing his tea and standing up. "Now, do not mention this mysterious woman to the Strathbane men. They are very busy and easily confused by complicated details." "I won't say a word, Hamish," she promised, puffing up with pride. Hamish slipped back out the kitchen door just in time to see Blair unceremoniously shoving Mr. Johnson into the back of a police cruiser. The hotel manager looked utterly terrified. Hamish felt a twinge of guilt, but he knew confronting Blair now would only cause his own suspension. He needed solid proof, and to get it, he needed to find out who the angry woman in the expensive coat was, and why she had come to a remote Highland village with a vial of poison. He whistled softly for lugs, his mind already mapping out his next quiet, unassuming move. Hamish watched from the shadows of the alleyway as the police cruiser carrying the hapless Mr. Johnson disappeared down the winding road towards Strathbane. The heavy, oppressive fog that had blanketed Lochdub all morning was finally beginning to lift, tearing into ragged ribbons that revealed patches of a startlingly clear, pale blue sky. It was turning into a crisp, biting Highland afternoon, the kind that stung the cheeks and made the lungs ache with its purity. It was not a day for rushing, which suited the village policeman perfectly. He untied lugs from the nearby fence post, earning an ecstatic tail wag, and hoisted the terrier into the passenger seat of his battered Land Rover. If he was going to uncover the identity of the mysterious, perfume-drenched woman who had confronted the English developer, he needed to consult someone who understood the convoluted social dynamics of wealthy, arrogant outsiders. He needed Priscilla Houberton Smythe. The drive to Tommel Castle, Priscilla's sprawling family estate, was a slow, rattling journey along single-track roads flanked by heather. Hamish drove with one hand draped lazily over the steering wheel, his mind turning over the clue of the small glass vial. The aroma of bitter almonds meant cyanide. It was an old-fashioned, theatrical sort of poison, entirely unsuited to a muddy Highland croft. It spoke of premeditation, of a deep-seated simmering hatred that belonged in a London drawing-room, not a Lochdub pub. He parked the Land Rover near the massive oak front doors of the castle, his heavy boots crunching loudly on the pristine gravel driveway. Lugs trotted faithfully at his heels as he rang the bell. A moment later, the butler did not open the door, but by Priscilla herself. She was dressed in immaculate riding clothes, her blonde hair pulled back tightly. As always, the mere sight of her caused a strange, uncomfortable knot to tighten in Hamish's chest. "Hamish," she said, her cool, refined voice betraying a hint of surprise. "I heard the sirens earlier. Has the village finally revolted against that awful developer?" "Something like that," Hamish murmured, pulling off his uniform cap and stepping into the cavernous, quietly opulent hallway. "He was found dead in his own mud bath this morning, murdered, and DCI Blair has already arrested poor Mr. Johnson for the crime." Priscilla's elegant eyebrows shot up. "Mr. Johnson? That is utterly absurd. The man is terrified of his own shadow. Enter the salon, Hamish. You look as though you have been standing in a freezer, and I was just about to have coffee." Hamish followed her, deeply grateful for the invitation. The drawing-room was a sanctuary of roaring fireplaces, deep velvet armchairs, and the lingering scent of wood smoke and old books. A silver coffee service sat on a low table, accompanied by a plate of delicate cucumber sandwiches with the crusts meticulously removed. Hamish folded his lanky frame into a remarkably expensive armchair, acutely aware of his scuffed boots. He accepted a fragile china cup and immediately devoured 3 sandwiches, much to Priscilla's amusement. "So, if Mr. Johnson didn't kill him, who did?" she asked, taking a delicate sip of her coffee. Hamish recounted his conversation with Jessie in the hotel kitchen, carefully detailing the argument, the expensive coat, and the small glass vial. "The Strathbane men missed the smell of bitter almonds at the scene," he concluded, his hazel eyes completely devoid of their usual sleepy veneer. "They were too busy shouting. I need to know who this woman is. You know the sort of circles this developer moved in down south. Would he have had enemies?" Priscilla set her cup down, her expression turning thoughtful. She stared into the crackling fire for a long moment before speaking. His digital wellness business was built on sand. Hamish. He had a reputation in London for securing massive investments from wealthy, gullible women and then declaring bankruptcy when the money vanished. He ruined reputations and emptied bank accounts. The woman Jessie saw, it sounds exactly like Eleanor Sterling. She was his latest investor, a fiercely proud heiress who lost nearly everything to his schemes just last month. Hamish sat back, a slow, satisfied smile spreading across his face. Eleanor Sterling. An heiress with a ruined reputation and a grudge. That sounds far more promising than a hotel manager angry over some rustic shelving. "She is dangerous, Hamish," Priscilla warned, her blue eyes sharp with concern. "Eleanor is not some panicked villager. She is calculating, resourceful, and absolutely ruthless when crossed." "Then it is a good thing I am just a stupid, lazy village policeman," Hamish drawled softly, reaching for another cucumber sandwich. "She will not be expecting me at all." Hamish finished the last of the cucumber sandwiches with a speed that bordered on the undignified, his mind already whirring beneath his placid exterior. Priscilla watched him with a mixture of amusement and genuine concern, her sharp intellect clearly matching his own as she leaned forward, the firelight dancing in her blue eyes. The name Eleanor Sterling hung in the air of the grand drawing-room like a cold draught. It was a name that belonged to the glossy world of London high society, a world that usually viewed the Highlands as a quaint backdrop for deer stalking, not a theatre for cold-blooded homicide. "If it is indeed Eleanor," Priscilla said, her voice dropping to a cautious whisper, "she won't be staying in a local bed and breakfast. She'll be hiding in plain sight, likely at one of the larger shooting lodges further up the glen, or perhaps she's already retreated to Inverness to wait for the fog to clear. She isn't the type to loiter at a crime scene, Hamish." "Aye," Hamish drawled, standing up and dusting crumbs from his tunic. "But the roads were closed by the mist last night, and the morning bus was cancelled. Unless she has wings, she's still nearby. I think I'll take a wander over to the old fishing lodge near the Aknasheen border. It's the only place grand enough for an heiress with a grudge and a vial of poison." He thanked Priscilla for the coffee, ignoring the brief, painful flutter in his chest as she walked him to the door. Luggs was already waiting by the Land Rover, his tail thumping against the gravel. As Hamish drove away from Tommel Castle, the afternoon sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks of the Quillins, casting long, bruised shadows across the heather. The peace of the glen was a stark contrast to the storm currently brewing at the Lockdub police station. When he reached the village, the scene outside the station was even more chaotic than before. DCI Blair was standing on the steps, his face a vivid shade of purple that almost matched the surrounding hills. He was surrounded by a gaggle of local reporters from the Strathbane Gazette, and he was basking in the unearned glory of a swift and decisive arrest. "We have our man," Blair was shouting, his chest puffed out like a territorial pigeon. The motive was local resentment, a classic case of Highland backwardness clashing with modern progress. Mr. Johnson will be charged overnight. The case is effectively closed, thanks to the superior investigative techniques of the Strathbane CID. Hamish slouched past the crowd, keeping his head down and his expression carefully vacant. He looked like a man who was only interested in his next meal, which was exactly how he wanted Blair to see him. He ducked into the station, intending to slip into the back room to check the missing persons and vehicle reports, but Blair's heavy hand slammed onto his shoulder. "Where have you been, Macbeth?" Blair barked, his breath smelling of stale cigarettes and peppermint. "I told you to stay put. I've solved your little murder while you were off napping in a haystack. I should have you up on charges of dereliction of duty. I was just checking the fences, sir," Hamish stammered, his voice thick with a fake, slow-witted burr. The sheep get very restless when there's a murder about. Very sensitive creatures, sheep. Blair snorted in derision. "Sheep? You're as thick as the beasts you tend, Macbeth. Get in there and start the paperwork for Johnson's processing. And don't touch anything important. I am going to the hotel for a celebratory steak." As Blair marched out to reclaim his audience, Hamish sighed with relief. He waited until the roar of Blair's car faded before moving to the evidence locker. He knew Blair hadn't bothered to look for the vial Jessie had described. The DCI was far too satisfied with his obvious suspect. Hamish began to sift through the victim's personal effects brought in from the croft. He found the white silk bathrobe, now a stiff brown mess of dried mud. He carefully checked the pockets. Nothing. He checked the lining. Nothing. Then his eyes caught a glimmer on the floor of the evidence bag. It was a small, torn piece of a local map, the kind given out at the tourist office. It was stained with a single dark thumbprint, but it wasn't the victim's print. It was too small, too delicate. More importantly, there was a tiny, dried smear of something that looked like green clay. "Green clay," Hamish whispered to Lugs, who was sniffing a stray boot. "There is no green clay in Lockdub, but there is a great deal of it at the old potter's shed behind the Aknasheen Lodge." The red herring was Blair's arrest of Mr. Johnson, a distraction that would let the real killer slip away. Hamish knew he had to move fast before the smart detectives from Strathbane realised their mistake and ruined the trail. He slipped out the back door, the cold evening air bracing him for the confrontation to come. The green clay was a curious detail, a tiny smudge of geographic evidence that Blair, in his rush to condemn the hotel manager, would have dismissed as common Highland muck. But Hamish knew his parish. The soil around Lochdub was heavy peat and grey slate. The only place for miles with that specific, mineral-rich green marl was the bank of the burn running behind the Aknasheen fishing lodge. It was a secluded spot, often frequented by artists and those seeking the kind of isolation that money could buy, but silence could protect. As the Land Rover rattled toward the border of the glen, the headlights cutting weak yellow tunnels through the gathering gloom, Hamish's mind returned to the image of Julian Vane face down in the mud. It wasn't just the money Eleanor Sterling had lost. There was something pettier at play, something deeply personal that had driven a sophisticated woman to travel to the edge of the world with a vial of poison. He pulled the vehicle into a thicket of Scots pine a half-mile from the lodge, preferring to approach on foot. Lugs trotted silently beside him, his ears alert to the scuttle of pine martens in the undergrowth. The lodge was a sprawling Victorian stone pile, its windows glowing with a deceptive warmth. As Hamish skirted the perimeter, he saw a light in the old potter's shed, small outbuilding that had been converted into a guest studio. He peered through the dusty glass. Inside, a woman was standing by a sink, frantically scrubbing her hands. She wore an expensive, tailored coat that looked entirely out of place, and her movements were jagged with panic. This was Eleanor Sterling, but she wasn't alone. A man stood in the shadows of the shed, watching her with a mixture of pity and exhaustion. It was Angus MacSween, the local handyman who had been helping Julian Vane with the renovations at the croft. Angus was a quiet, invisible man, the kind who fixed leaking pipes and mended fences without ever drawing a second glance. Hamish watched as Angus reached out and took the woman shaking hands in his own, his rough, weathered fingers a stark contrast to her pale, manicured skin. "It's done, Eleanor," Angus said, his voice a low rumble that carried through the thin walls of the shed. "The police have arrested the manager. They aren't looking for you. You should leave tonight, before the fog returns." "He deserved it, Angus," she hissed, her voice cracking with a sharp, brittle edge. "He didn't just steal my inheritance. He laughed when I told him I had nothing left. He told me the mud at the croft would be good for my waning youth. He was a monster." Hamish felt a cold knot of understanding tighten in his chest. This wasn't just a financial dispute. It was the motive of a woman scorned and humiliated, fueled by the quiet, steady assistance of a local man who had his own reasons for hating the developer. Julian Vane had likely treated Angus like a servant, insulting his heritage and his work, never realizing that the useless peasant was observant enough to help an angry woman commit the perfect crime. Angus knew the layout of the croft, the timing of the mud bath treatments, and exactly how to bypass the village's limited security. The hidden motive was a toxic blend of urban arrogance and Highland resentment. Eleanor had provided the poisoned cyanide from her family's old estate supplies, but Angus had provided the opportunity. He had probably been the one to lead the incapacitated Julian into the pit after the poison began to take hold, ensuring the death looked like a tragic, clumsy accident in the dark. It was a partnership of convenience, born from a shared hatred of a man who viewed people as commodities to be used and discarded. Hamish adjusted his cap, his expression hardening. He could hear the distant, rhythmic thumping of Blair's car returning to the village, likely to finalize the paperwork for the wrong man. If Hamish moved now, he would be caught in a violent confrontation with two desperate people. If he waited, Eleanor would vanish into the night, and Angus would return to his quiet life, leaving Mr. Johnson to face a life sentence for a crime he didn't have the stomach to conceive. He needed a plan, something that would force the truth out without the messy intervention of Blair's shouting. He needed to set a trap that played on their guilt and their fear of the very land they had used to hide their sin. The cold air of the glen seemed to thicken as Hamish watched the silhouettes through the grimy glass of the potter's shed. He knew that a direct arrest would result in a chaotic denial, and with DCI Blair already parading a solved case back in Lochdub, Hamish's word against an heiress and a well-liked local handyman would be laughed out of the Strathbane Sheriff's Court. He needed them to convict themselves, and he needed to do it using the one thing Julian Vane had prized above all else, his miraculous therapeutic mud. Hamish tapped a rhythmic, slow beat against his thigh, his mind weaving a web of Highland superstition and modern anxiety. He whistled low for lugs and retreated into the darkness of the pines, making his way back to the Land Rover. 10 minutes later, Hamish pulled up to the front of the Aknasheen Lodge, the engine of his vehicle backfiring with a startling crack that echoed off the hills. He didn't sneak this time. He climbed out, adjusted his cap to a particularly jaunty, foolish angle, and began shouting for Angus MacSween as if he were looking for a lost sheep. The door to the shed creaked open, and Angus stepped out, his face a mask of stony indifference, though his hands remained shoved deep into his pockets. "Och, Angus! Thank the Lord I found you," Hamish panted, leaning heavily against the fender of the Land Rover. He looked exhausted, frantic, and entirely dim-witted. "I've had a terrible fright up at the croft. The Strathbane men, they've gone and left the scene, saying they've got their man in the hotel manager. But something's wrong with that mud pit, Angus." Sommeting Hannah Tyrrell. Angus narrowed his eyes, his frame tense. "What are you blethering about, Macbeth? The man's dead. The police took him away." "Aye, they took the body," Hamish whispered, leaning in close so that Eleanor Sterling, who he knew was listening behind the shed door, would hear every word. "But they didn't take the evidence. You see, the forensics boys are coming back with a special chemical tomorrow morning, something that turns bright, neon blue the moment it touches even a trace of cyanide. They say it can track the poison back to whoever handled it, like a trail of glowing breadcrumbs. But that's not the trouble." Hamish paused, glancing nervously over his shoulder at the empty road. "The trouble is the mud itself. It started to hiss. Mrs. Wellington says it's the banshee's breath. She says when a man is murdered with poison in the earth, the ground won't keep the secret. It's bubbling up, Angus. If anyone touched that mud, or dropped anything in it like a glass stopper or a silk thread, it's going to be sitting right on top of the slush by midnight, glowing like a lantern." He saw the Adam's apple in Angos' throat bob convulsively. Behind him, the shed door shifted a fraction of an inch. "I am just a simple policeman," Hamish continued, his voice dropping to a confidential, mournful tone. "I don't want any more trouble. I came to ask if Yow'd help me cover the pit with some old tarpaulins before the blue glow starts. I don't want the village seeing it and thinking the place is cursed. It would ruin the tourism, wouldn't it? If there's anything in that mud that shouldn't be there, we ought to fish it out before the specialists arrive at dawn with their laboratory kits." Angus hesitated, his loyalty to the terrified woman inside warring with his own survival instinct. A blue glow? That's nonsense, Hamish. Science doesn't work like that. "Och, that's what I thought," Hamish exclaimed, waving a hand dismissively. But the inspector was very firm. He said the cyanide reaction is foolproof. He left his kit there in a black box, ready for the morning. "I'm too afraid to go up there alone in the dark, Angus. Will you come, or should I just leave the banshee's breath to tell its tale to the morning sun?" Hamish returned to his car, moving with deliberate slowness. He knew the bait was irresistible. To a murderer, the idea of a glowing chemical trail leading straight to their door was a nightmare. To a superstitious Highlander like Angus, the banshee's breath was even worse. He climbed into the driver's seat and waited. Sure enough, after a tense minute of whispering, arguing inside the shed, Angus emerged, followed by a pale, hooded figure in an expensive coat. They climbed into Angus' old truck. "We'll follow you, Macbeth," Angus shouted, his voice tight. "Just to settle your nerves." Hamish smiled into the darkness of the cabin, a sharp, predatory glint in his eyes that no one in Lochdub ever saw. The trap was set. He wasn't leading them to a chemical kit or a supernatural phenomenon. He was leading them straight into the arms of the one thing they feared more than the Lothair own panicked desperation. As the two vehicles began the climb back toward the mud-slicked croft, the moon broke through the clouds, illuminating the path to the final confrontation. The Land Rover's headlights bounced across the rugged, peat-scarred track, casting long, frantic shadows that seemed to leap out from the heather. Behind him, the twin yellow eyes of Angus Maxween's truck followed with a desperate, mechanical persistence. Hamish Macbeth sat hunched over the wheel, his face illuminated by the green glow of the dashboard. The facade of the lazy, bumbling village Bobby had vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp-eyed intensity. He knew Highland criminal psychology better than any Strathbane Academy textbook. It was not the fear of the law that broke a man here, it was the fear of the land itself turning witness against him. He reached the crest of the hill where the sanctuary stood as a skeletal monument to Julian Vane's vanity. The mud pit was a dark, obsidian eye in the moonlight, its surface reflecting the stars with a slick, oily sheen. Hamish cut the engine and stepped out, the silence of the glen rushing back to fill the void. A moment later, the truck pulled up, and Angus stepped out, followed closely by the hooded figure of Eleanor Stirling. She clutched the lapels of her expensive coat, her eyes darting toward the pit with a mixture of revulsion and terror. "Where is it, Macbeth?" Angus demanded, his voice cracking like dry kindling. "Where is this blue glow you were blethering about? It looks just like plain old mud to me." Hamish stood at the edge of the pit, his lanky frame silhouetted against the pale moon. He looked incredibly small and harmless, yet there was a new stillness to his posture. "Och, it's coming, Angus." The inspector said the reaction takes time to brew. "But look there, in the corner. You see that little glint of glass? It looks like a stopper. I am thinking if we just reach in and grab it, the trail won't start at all." Eleanor Stirling broke. She shoved past Angus, her desperation overriding her sophistication. "Give me that rake!" she hissed, spotting a tool leaning against the timber frame. "If that vial is found, I am ruined." "He was a thief, Angus. He took everything. I won't let a bottle of heart medicine destroy me now." "Heart medicine." Hamish's voice was suddenly as sharp as a Highland frost. "I don't recall mentioning heart medicine, Miss Stirling. I only mentioned cyanide, and I don't recall mentioning a vial at all." The woman froze, the rake halfway to the surface of the mud. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She turned, her face pale and twisted in the moonlight. Angus, realizing the trap had snapped shut, let out a low, guttural growl of betrayal. He was a man of the hills, strong and broad-shouldered, and he moved toward Hamish with a heavy, menacing tread. "You think you're clever, Macbeth?" Angus spat, his hands curling into massive fists. "You think you can deceive a man on his own land? There's no blue light. There's no kit. It's just you and a dog against the two of us. Well, just put you in the pit with the Sassenach, and the banshee's breath can have you both." Angus jumped surprisingly fast for a man his size, but Hamish Macbeth was not the slow, clumsy creature he pretended to be. He had spent his life navigating the treacherous scree of the mountains and wrestling stubborn rams into pens. He sidestepped the charge with a fluid, athletic grace, his hand snapping out to catch Angus' wrist. Using the man's own momentum, Hamish pivoted, sending the heavy handyman stumbling toward the edge of the pit. Before Angus could recover, Hamish was on him. He didn't use the brutal, clubbing blows of a Strathbane sergeant. He used leverage and speed. He pinned Angus against the timber frame, his forearm pressed firmly against the man's throat. "Stay down, Angus," Hamish whispered, his voice calm but terrifyingly firm. "I've got the local doctor and 2 of the village men waiting in the ruins of the croft. They've heard every word Miss Stirling just said. The game is over." Eleanor Stirling dropped the rake, her knees buckling as she collapsed onto the wet grass. She began to sob, a harsh, dry sound that was swallowed by the wind. Angus went limp, the fight draining out of him as he looked into Hamish's hazel eyes and finally saw the man behind the mask. "You're not as stupid as you look, are you, Macbeth?" Angus wheezed. "No, Angus," Hamish said softly, pulling out his handcuffs. "But it's a very useful way to live. Now, let's get you both to the station before the fog returns. I've got a pot of tea waiting, and I suspect we're all going to need it." The night air at the croft was thick with the scent of damp earth, and the sharp, clinical smell of failure as Hamish marched his two prisoners toward the waiting Land Rover. Lugs trotted behind them, his tail held high as if he personally had wrestled Angus Maxween to the ground. Eleanor Sterling was a broken shadow of her former self, her expensive coat smeared with the very mud she had hoped would swallow her crimes. Angus walked with a heavy, rhythmic trudge, the silent resignation of a man who knew the hills had finally stopped hiding him. Hamish, however, was not celebrating. As the adrenaline of the confrontation began to ebb, a much more terrifying prospect filled his mind: the reward for his competence. If he walked into the Lochdub station and presented this pair of killers to the world, the chief constable in Strathbane would be ecstatic. There would be commendations, press conferences, and the ultimate Highland nightmare promotion to sergeant, and a permanent transfer to the grey, concrete bustle of the city. He stopped the Land Rover a few hundred yards from the village lights, the engine idling with a rhythmic chug. He turned in his seat to look at the two bedraggled figures in the back. "Now, listen to me carefully," Hamish said, his voice dropping into that slow, conspiratorial lilt that made him sound like a man who struggled with basic arithmetic. "DCI Blair is a very important man. He is a very proud man. He has already told all of Scotland he caught the killer at the hotel. If I bring you in and tell him he was wrong, he is going to be very, very cross. And across DCI Blair is a man who makes life miserable for everyone." Eleanor looked up, her tear-streaked face reflecting the moonlight. "What are you saying, Macbeth?" "I am saying," Hamish drawled, "that if you were to tell the inspector that he was so clever, so terrifyingly brilliant in his interrogation of the hotel manager, that you felt the walls closing in, well, he might be inclined to treat you with a bit more dignity. If you tell him that his presence in the village made you so nervous that you tried to flee tonight, only to be stopped by his strategic placement of a local constable on the hill, well, then everyone is happy." Angus gave a short, dry chuckle. "You want that loud-mouthed buffoon to take the credit, don't you? You're terrified of a desk in Inverness." "I am a man of simple needs, Angus," Hamish replied with a faint, enigmatic smile. "And a desk in Inverness has no room for a dog or a brood of hens." They reached the station just as Blair was emerging from the hotel, looking remarkably well-fed and smelling of expensive brandy. He saw the Land Rover and began to purple immediately, his hands going to his hips. "Macbeth, I told you to stay out of my sight. What is this? Why are you driving around with civilian passengers?" Hamish scrambled out of the driver's seat, tripping slightly over his own feet for effect. "Och, Inspector!" "You won't believe it. Your brilliant arrest of Mr. Johnson, it worked. It worked, just like you said it would." Blair blinked, his rage momentarily paused by the unexpected flattery. "Of course it worked. What are you blethering about?" "These two," Hamish gestured vaguely at the back of the car, looking as though he had accidentally found a pair of rare coins in his pocket. "They were so spooked by the way you handled the manager, Miss Sterling here, says she could feel your investigative genius, circling the lodgett hat, they tried to make a run for it. I was just sitting on the hill, like you told me to, keeping a useless eye on things, when they practically drove into my lap and started confessing. They realized there was no escape from a man of your caliber, sir." Blair's chest expanded until the buttons on his waistcoat looked ready to fly off like shrapnel. He looked at the dishevelled heiress and the silent handyman, then back at the stupid constable who looked as though he was struggling to stand upright. The prospect of taking credit for a double arrest on top of his initial theory was too tempting for a man of Blair's vanity to resist. "I see!" Blair barked, smoothing his hair and adopting a stern, authoritative posture for the benefit of the two junior detectives trailing behind him, just as I suspected. A pincer movement. "I used the hotel manager as a decoy to flush out the real conspirators. Excellent work, Blair, if I do say so myself. You, Macbeth, get these two inside and start the tea. I have a phone call to make to the Commissioner. And don't you dare mention that you did anything more than sit there and wait for them to fall into your lap." "Not a word, sir," Hamish promised, his eyes twinkling with a hidden, wicked delight. "I wouldn't dream of it." As Blair marched inside to claim his glory, Hamish leaned against the station's cold stone wall. He had done it. He was still the village idiot, still a lowly constable, and most importantly, he was still exactly where he wanted to be. The credit shifted, the danger of promotion vanished, and the peace of Lockdub was almost restored. All that remained was the quiet return to the life he loved.